But it's been on my mind how we're trying to quantify what we're looking for. And then we realize what we really want, it's not for sale.
Welcome to The Art of Quality, the podcast seeking wisdom in business, investing, systems, and the art of paying attention. Each episode uncovers rare stories from practitioners who have spent years pursuing multi-generational excellence in their craft. We are seeking to understand how the world really works and how we can align our actions to it. I am your host, John Candito, and this is our series on the art of quality in investing.
John Candito is the founder and managing partner of the Phronesis Fund, the lead sponsor of this series. This podcast is for informational purposes only and is not investment advice. The podcast host, guests, and clients of the Phronesis Fund may maintain positions in securities that are discussed.
My guest today is Bogumil Baranowski. Bogumil is the founder of Blue Infinitas Capital and the host of the Talking Billions podcast. We are also joined by Art of Quality co-host Paul Higgins. In this episode, we discuss building trust over generations, giving gifts with warm hands, risks that even the richest people cannot afford, forgotten money, and much more. Please enjoy our conversation with Bogumil Baranowski. All right, I'm excited to do this. Bogumil, welcome to The Art of Quality.
Well, thank you for having me. I have to stop myself because I usually kick off those conversations, and I had to wait until you speak first. It's a habit, So I'm working on it.
No problem. No, I've been grateful to be a guest on Bogumil's podcast, Talking Billions, and we're excited to host him here on The Art of Quality. So tell us, what have you been thinking about lately? What are you excited about these days?
My wife makes fun of me that I'm reading 10 books at the same time. So when you ask that question, and I have to narrow it down to one thing, there is an overarching topic that's been on my mind. And the closer I get, the fewer words I have to describe it. So I'll just start somewhere in the middle. And Vitaly Katznelson, who was on the show, described it as soul in the game. He wrote a book about it. And you and I talked about it quite a bit too. And I've talked with Christian Billinger, who manages money out of London, his family money. We talked about it too. And it's this idea of finding a pursuit when you can completely pour your heart and soul and mind and everything into it. And then I was thinking about how we think about the incentives. We look at the compensation that the CEO gets. When do the options vest? And what are the goals and targets and all those things? But what we're really looking for is somebody that will do the right thing when nobody's watching. A Warren Buffett, Charlie Munger kind of experience where they already exceeded, financially speaking, anything they ever wanted to have. But they kept on showing up and doing the right thing and writing letters as if, at some point, their sister or sisters were reading those letters, right? So you're writing them to family. And then there's this higher idea of finding somebody in your life, or being that somebody in your life that's so passionate about something that they will go the extra mile. And what's important to me is that they're not doing it for the money. They're way beyond that point. And that they truly care. Those three things. And that's connected to trust. And I'm sure we'll talk more about trust. That you find somebody you can trust that way. And at the end of the day, the outcome has a certain quality. And I'm sure we'll talk more about quality. But it's been on my mind how we're trying to quantify what we're looking for. And then we realize what we really want, it's not for sale.
So many ways we could take that. I love it. I'm going to assume that you may have been doing some writing on that lately. And for those that don't know, Bogumil's put out 4 books and a TED Talk, and I mentioned Talking Billions, his podcast, and a number of wonderful essays, and I'd encourage you to encounter those. But is it fair to say you've been writing on this topic?
Yes. So it came up in many places. And the last piece that I'm writing more recently is about trust. I was thinking about the word trust, what it means. And we'll talk more about it. But that idea, I serve as an advisor to families that have had money for many generations in many cases, or aspire to have their money last. And I realize that the help, the service, the guidance that I provide it goes beyond any, quantifiable incentive, compensation scheme, right? So there are moments where somebody has a problem. This morning I was talking to a client who's been a client for a while, and we're talking about something for much longer than we both thought we'll talk about, but I felt like I need to create that space. And if I was a lawyer, I would be thinking in terms of billable hours. Is it a full hour, not a full hour, 15 minutes, right? And I feel so free that I can spend that extra time with her because she needs me and she wants to talk about it. And I don't have to be thinking in terms of quotas, goals, quarterly numbers or anything like that. I'm just needed in the moment. And I can be fully there. And you could say that I won't be ever paid for it. I won't ever get any credit for it. That's absolutely fine. But I did my best in that moment for that individual.
So one of the things we wanted to talk to you about is, as we prepared for this episode, there was sort of mutual agreement amongst the hosts here that you are world-class at, I'm sure, many things, but one of those being at building trust. And I think some of that comes from the fact that you're one of the few people we know who really thinks in centuries and thinks multi-generationally. And I know that goes back to, I've always enjoyed what I've learned from you about, the history of the evolution of wealth and how to keep it and how to lose it, and then also how to preserve it and how to grow it. So maybe we could riff on that. I mean, I know as you're building trust, you're not thinking just about, let's build trust so we can invest together for the next quarter or the next year. You're thinking the next century, the next generation. So when you go at things from that perspective, what are some of the things you do that sort of builds trust in that way rather than maybe the more short-term way, I think, that's much more common in the world?
You're touching on so many interesting things. So let me take one at a time. So when I think about the 100 years, and you and I talked about the infinite games, James Cars and other people talked about it, but the concept really spoke to me, and I'll circle back to building trust. When you think about the games that we play, and maybe the audience is familiar, maybe not with the concepts, but most of the games we play are finite. There's an end to it. There's a winner and a loser, a game of chess and so on. But now there are games like friendship, for example, that are open-ended. Hopefully you're not thinking about winning or losing this game. What you want is to continue the game. And looking at investing or pursuit of knowledge or any other thing that way opens up a whole new world of opportunity, because you can pursue things that will bring fruit much later, maybe not even in your lifetime in some cases with the families I work with. And it's fascinating to me to expand that time horizon. I got into investing because I picked up a book, One Up on Wall Street. I told you about it in Brussels when I was an exchange student, and Peter Lynch's book. And it spoke to me because I thought this is a fascinating puzzle that I can solve. Not in the sense that I'll become the richest person in the world or that I'll beat the market, but I thought this is something I could really spend time on, think about, analyze, and figure out. And then once I started working in the investment profession, I opened my eyes to the people whose money I manage. And I realized it's a whole new dimension that's not talked about enough. And then you start to realize, how do they think about that money? And I've been in rooms with people that have had money for 200 years as a family. And it's absolutely fascinating to consider that as a family, they were able to navigate the ups and downs and world conflicts. They might have had to change locations, change assets that the money is in, and continue to perpetuate that wealth over 100 or 200 years. It's not a matter of luck at that point. Making the first million, maybe it is. But if you keep so much money over a long period of time, you need to have a plan, a strategy, and a real thought that exceeds a lifetime. And you can't have it without trust.
Very much. Yeah, it makes me think, I know that you were serving families during the financial crisis in 07 and 08, and that was, certainly one of those moments of, I'm sure, unfortunately for some families, they survived for 200 years and then that one got them. And so what did you learn about building trust through, sort of a possibly existential, moment like that?
I think the idea is that you build trust over time and you kind of call for it and need it in times. And it's a two-way street, right? So you know that they trust you and you can trust them, that they'll be with you through the hardest times. Investing is such a peculiar pursuit. And the more time I spend thinking about it, the more unusual it really appears, because you can make the biggest difference in times when there's complete chaos outside, right? And sometimes all that the client needs is somebody to talk to that will tell them that everything will be fine. We know what we're holding. We know what kind of businesses we have and why we have them. We have a pretty good idea how they can perform and survive no matter what the circumstances are. We don't own one single business. We hold a portfolio. Some of them might fall behind. But it gives them a certain comfort that, a captain on the ship will give you, that no matter what's going on, I'm going to stay at the helm and I'll be here, right? And that person might not have all the answers. If anything, that person might have the ability to ask better questions and stay calm through a very uncertain period of time. And those times will repeat and repeat. Actually, when you expand the horizon, the time horizon, more of those situations will happen, right? You could have a 3-year period or even a 5-year period where no storm happens somehow. And you feel like, I got this. And then you get surprised with something. And these are the moments, the defining moments, that allow some families to thrive and other families to truly fall behind. And I might have told you how in March of 2020, I took those calls from clients and they would just say, I just wanted to hear your voice. And they said, just get back to what you were doing. I want to hear your voice. And I thought it was so powerful that I earned something with them that would outlast this crisis and many others. And it doesn't show up on the balance sheet. It's not in the annual report or any official filing that you file as an advisor. But it's there, and they know it's there. And I have a good sense that it is there, right? And that's something that's absolutely priceless if you want to take this profession in the way that I decided to take it. And I think the challenge is that the financial industry has become very product-driven, marketing-driven, and very short-term driven, right? Both in terms of actual sales of products and quotas and goals. And people forget about the client. And I think you can't forget about the client because the client is at the heart of what you're trying to do. And sometimes you won't maximize the profit or optimize your P&L. And it's absolutely secondary. That's what we started talking about, right? Because you know that you're doing exactly what the client needs. And you might not bill for it. And again, you might get no credit for it. And nobody might know about it. And if you're absolutely fine with it, I think you're in the right field for the right reasons.
It's beautifully put. It reminds me of one of my favorite sentiments expressed by Voltaire is history never repeats, but man always does. And if you can zoom out enough and see man repeating, meaning being tempted to behave poorly in crises or behave well in crisis, understand that relationships are at the root of most things, those things that you're sort of speaking to here. I think that's a piece of getting to this intergenerational, multi-generational durability, where we know we'll have another crisis and it might be today and it might be in 10 years, but either way, either we're, we understand how to handle it well or we don't. I love that notion of, I just wanted to hear your voice. That's fantastic. How have you kind of taken that, maybe for the families who say, I've just wanted to hear your voice, how have you thought about a decade from now, 2, 3, hopefully we're all around 4, 5, 6 decades from now. We don't know, but there's a component of that of maybe steering through the financial crisis with the current generation in charge. And then there's being ready with the next generation and the next generation. So how have you handled that?
I think it's a fascinating topic because when people think about the client, they think of a static experience. You onboarded Paul and Paul is your best client and you love talking to Paul. You might have even taken him sailing once. This actual Paul sailed with me at some point. Maybe he'll share more.
You've gotten me into it. It's a lifelong pursuit now. I'm still sailing.
Good for you. So you have your favorite client, but then Paul has kids, or Paul has nieces and nephews, and I've worked with multiple generations at times. I knew the grandparents or the great-grandparents, and I know the parents, and I know the kids, and I'm getting to know the grandkids. And I find it as just part of the experience that it's not static, right? It's a dynamic flow, and it's different individuals. Even if they grew up in the same household, they are not like their parents. We know that, right? And, two siblings could be very, very different how they think about money. I mean, I've seen those stories and hear those stories when the kids are, a few years apart, and the family was at a different stage, even, financially speaking. And one grew up with a sense of not enough, and the other one grew up with a sense of abundance. And they have very different perception of risk, rewards, how easily money comes, how easily it can be spent, right? So it's that kind of, compassion and empathy that you have to include in the conversation to realize this $1 million means something different to John than it does to Paul. Why is that? And you could be an investment advisor that says, I'm just managing a portfolio in an abstract way, in a vacuum, and I don't care that half of it is John's, half of it is Paul's, right? You could do that. But I find it almost impossible. It's like a doctor asking, so you have a pain in your knee, here's the pill. I just want to know, how did this happen? Did you hit your knee against something? What's going on with that knee? Like, I feel like all those additional questions give you context that I can serve Paul better and John better, and they might have very different needs, and sometimes it's just the turn of phrase that the portfolio doesn't have to be completely different. It's just how you talk about it is different because they're individuals and they see things differently. And I just can't help it. It's part of the experience. You want to know how people interact with the money that you manage.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. It also makes me think there's a sort of building trust with, let's say, the current generation and those to follow it. There's also something about building trust with the more senior generations, which, amongst other things, tend to, have collected more wisdom than those that are younger than them for the most part. And so how have you thought about building trust, maybe in terms of not just for down the road, but also mentorship relationships?
So I find it fascinating how the part of the world that I operate in, family wealth, I realize how we've made a huge progress in the last probably 100 or 200 years in terms of doing what you just mentioned, which is including the next generation. I think some people might have this image of, family trusts where the kids are not trusted or included in the conversation, and then they're surprised with this inheritance and they feel like a certain control and power was taken away from them. And I feel like we shifted, and I see a lot of people going in that direction. One of the people that I admire, who's a good friend, Jay Hughes, that you might know about, who worked with wealthy families over many, many decades, he thinks of the gift itself, that there's this technical, legal, and tax transfer of assets between generations, almost scientific, surgical. But then there's the emotional story. And I like this idea of a gift with warm hands, right? How you give the money. You can receive it in a different way. And you might think, it doesn't matter, but it does matter because it has an impact on how this money is integrated into people's lives and what kind of an impact it has. But I feel like and maybe it's the universe that I operate in, that I see how people are more open to including the next generation, having them in the room. And in some cases, in my work in the last 20 years, I worked with some of the younger generation that came and worked as interns with me. And then, 10 or 15 years later, they're in the room and they have some decision-making power, and they feel like they might be in a field that has nothing to do with investments, but they know what kind of questions to ask. And I think it's hugely empowering to be able to understand what's going on and how they can benefit the most. At the end of the day, when you have this asset transfer between generations, you want it to have the most positive impact you can imagine, right? So what can we do to make sure that happens? And obviously, we're thinking, I'm an investment advisor, so I want to turn $1 million into 2 to 4 to 8. But that's only one dimension of what I'm trying to do, right? I'm trying to make sure that the whole experience is positive and it makes my life easier. And I feel like it brings me so much more joy when I see that they were ready to receive it. And it helps them in so many different ways instead of being a burden or something that takes the joy out of their life.
One area I'd love to explore Munger always tells that story about why he has to close his fund. And over the years, I've heard very different versions of it. But effectively, after a couple of years of volatile performance, some of his close family and friends had such an allergic, almost emotional reaction to the volatility that he said, I'm actually not going to continue to do this because it's actually sacrificing things that matter to me at a relationship level for something that I can do elsewhere in a better form. I can imagine in building trust in the relationships that you nurture over time, that dynamic exists in many different forms. But surely it's almost a 5-year question. Like, how do you go about even thinking about those things in the early years of building relationships with clients and with just folks in your network generally? Be interested to explore that.
I love that question. You brought up volatility. I tell clients that it's not just the performance that matters, but the journey itself, right? So you could have two managers and both show you, I mean, let's pick a number, whatever, 12, 15, 10, 9%. But that's only a sliver of the story. I want to know, how did you get there, right? Because you might have gotten there with years that were up 50, down 50, up 50, down 50. And it's an incredible experience for the investor. Or you could have gotten that to the same place in a more comfortable way without that kind of a stormy experience. So that's something that matters to me. I look at the portfolio and not to get too technical today, but I'd like to hold 30 plus investments that make sense to me, and I want to hold them open-ended. And some of them I will hold for 3-5 years, some of them longer. But it's a choice, and the things that end up in the portfolio, I talk about the quality of sleep. I talk about not having zeros in the portfolio. I don't want to have stocks that could potentially go to zeros. It's a personal choice that influences how clients perceive it. And I think that's what you're referring to, that looking at Munger's performance in the 70s, from what I remember, I think would have been really hard to remain an investor. And you're bringing up something that's been on my mind lately. And I came back from a conference from Guy Spears Value X, and I was listening to different investors. And I don't want to generalize, but I think there are at least, a few buckets. And not everybody was represented. I don't want to generalize, but there are people that are really, really good at investing. And they'll find an investment that's very scary to hold, but it could have an incredible upside. And they have the stomach to do it. But they might never find a client who wants to join them on that journey, right? And then you have people that can balance both. And I find it very appealing to find an investment that works. I mean, very few things get me more excited, intellectually speaking, than finding an idea that makes sense. And I'm so glad we have it. But I also think about who will have to look at this portfolio and feel comfortable holding this, right? So it's part of the equation. And then there are people who I think are incredible growing assets, and that's a whole different skill. And I think that the three kind of coexist in our universe. Some people that will never have outside money, and that's fine. They just manage their own money. And there are people that are incredible at gathering assets and might not be as strong on the investment side, right? So you have to kind of balance all three if you want to see investing as a business, right? Because if it's a personal pursuit, it's a whole different thing. I actually brought it up on the podcast many times when I asked some people that transitioned from managing their own money to managing their own family money and then managing other people's money. And it's not that one is easier or harder. They're completely different, right? Like when you're managing just your own money, the only person that you have to answer to is the person you see in the mirror or your spouse. But then if you're managing family money, it gets very hard. Managing friends' money, I think it's very tricky too. Actually, Vitaly Katzenelson told me that on purpose, he doesn't take money from his friends because he wants to have this ability to leave his work and go have a nice dinner with friends and not be asked, how is the portfolio doing? And I thought this is really interesting because a lot of us, in the early days, rely on family and friends. And people
that's the common start. Yeah, interesting.
Right? But then you might have that kind of conversation over a casual dinner. But anyways, when you accept other people's money, it's a whole different experience. And back to your point, I think you have to take into account, would they be willing to be on this journey with you? And it's a journey, and it's not an easy journey. And what is it that you can do, from my perspective, to make this journey enjoyable for them? not just getting from 1 to 2, from 2 to 4, from 4 to 8, but so that we can all stay on the bus and enjoy it.
Yeah, very much. That's well put. One of the things that I've enjoyed learning from you, and I'd love you to riff on a little bit, is you grew up behind the Iron Curtain. And I think you experienced destruction of wealth in a way that certainly I haven't. And one of the things you often say is you think securing multi-generational success will take a massive rethinking from some of the practices that are common today. And I certainly think, I mean, just the way you would look at risk, I mean, for, say, Americans, I mean, nobody's experienced a total wipeout of an economy in generations. And there are a lot of countries, fortunately, that are like that. There are others that aren't. And so I'd love to, success is certainly not guaranteed. And so how has that experience growing up and how has that kind of affected how you think about securing multi-generational success and dealing with volatility and so forth?
I think I didn't realize it at the time, but over time, I accepted that period really taught me a lot. So I was born in 1980, and I remember the last decade of that economic experiment that some people call communism, socialism, whatever you want to call it. The government owned all the businesses, and you could only work for the government. And there was a suspended private ownership of most assets with very few exceptions. So that's how it looked. And obviously it came with very restricted freedoms, not just economic freedoms, but what you could say and share, and you could get in real trouble. And so that's the context. And looking back, I realized that my range of experiences is so much wider than had I grown up in Paris or New York. And I found a way to tap into it and see it as an enriching experience, right? And I know people that grew up in New York in wealthy families and have that kind of perspective naturally somehow. So it's not a given that you have to grow up in a communist country. I don't think it's a requirement. Just in my education became a prerequisite for my own education. But anyways, it allowed me to ask more questions and maybe doubt a little bit and be more of a skeptic. And it's around ownership. It's around economic incentives that we talked about. But the fact that I like to ask, like, what is it that I own, and do I own it for sure? And even in these days, in many places on Earth, you might buy a piece of land and then realize you don't actually own it. You bought it from a guy that doesn't even own it, or it's contested, and so on. U.S. is a very unique experience because I think it was built around the idea of allowing people to get rich and keep what they have. And I think it's a huge difference because there are many places on Earth where you can get rich, but there are very few places that will allow you to stay rich. You just get so much attention from the wrong places, and somebody will come and take it away. That's the human experience. And in the past, it would have been the emperor or the king. And these days, it's government regulations, taxes, and big shifts in governments where they come and confiscate your stuff. So that's something that's on my mind. In the U.S., really, with very slight exceptions, maybe around the change, how we couldn't own gold in the 1930s until 1970s, with that exception, which I don't want to forget about because it is a violation of property rights. The U.S., if you owned something, it was yours to keep. And I know families that have oil rights and oil royalties that date back 5-6 generations, and they still get paid on those, which is to me incredible. The continuity across so many generations, it's theirs. I don't know how many presidents came and went and how many wars happened in between, but it's still theirs, right? So I think that's a certain appreciation for things that in the US or even in Europe, Western Europe, people take for granted. For me, it's a miracle, and it is something you should pay attention to, as something to value, because it allows for a whole different way of looking at wealth, not something that you have for a brief period of time, but something that you can build and you can hold on to, hopefully for many generations to come.
That's well put. I wonder, we are so intermediated these days. I'm sure there's multiple businesses that we hold in common. But even if you just work through the chain of how we hold it, you buy some security, and that used to be a physical paper claim on the profits of a business. Now that's a digital claim intermediated through a broker held by a custodian, or in many, many ways it's sometimes wrapped in an ETF. There's just so many intermediaries that if all the lights went out and the power went off and so on, and you kind of said, all right, I need to go get my hands on my wealth, I sometimes think we don't think seriously enough about what are those real claims? If worse came to worse and you had to grab them, so to speak. It's certainly not what's showing up on the screen of your phone. And you put beautifully that it's sort of a minor miracle that in some parts of the world, those claims have been extremely well protected and honored, with some exception. But I imagine there are a number of risk vectors that we're probably not thinking about deeply enough. And you mentioned the confiscation of gold, which was a violation of property rights in the States. But what are some of I'm thinking you're talking about a massive rethinking of intergenerational wealth. What are some of those risk vectors that maybe, on average, we're not taking seriously enough?
Well, speaking about the massive rethinking, and I write about it in Money Life Family, one of the books, how when you think about wealth creation, it might have taken one single business, one single location, and sometimes one individual that created the bulk of it. And I'm oversimplifying, but that rhymes throughout history around the globe. And I meet so many families that even now, because of the podcast, reach out from very exotic places. And they tell me stories that rhyme with the families that I know that might be from the US or Europe. And I say, wow, it's incredible. It's a human experience, and it could be the grandpa's story, the grandma's story, and what would seem like an excessive risk, but to me, they just captured an incredible opportunity that created a very substantial life-changing wealth. Now, there's a certain transition from creating wealth to keeping and growing it. It's not static. It's not frozen. It will continue to grow. And actually, all of us on this call know the power of compound interest and compounding. If you have time, and if you're compounding wealth at a rate that's not even eye-popping, but very respectable, that amount will double and double and double and double. And I've seen that happen. And it's really, there's this image that I have in mind. I think Morgan Housel talks about it, how Buffett created 99% of his wealth after the age of 65. Am I right about it? Something along those lines.
Yes.
And I thought about, Buffett was already rich at 45. But he wasn't that kind of rich that he became in his 70s and 80s, right? So compounding it's a non-linear experience, and I think it completely escapes our comprehension how it works, because we're so used to the linear experience. I'll pick up 2 eggs, and then I have 4 eggs, and I have 5 eggs and 6 eggs. But doubling beyond a certain point, it just escapes our imagination, right? That in the last year, if you're doubling, or in the last period, let's say, you just doubled in the last 5 years what you already doubled. That experience is very hard to understand. But back to your point of rethinking, you have to go from the mindset, and I see some families realize that, of creating wealth to keeping and growing it over time. And that will require not a single business, but probably a portfolio of businesses, which is, to me, stock investing is holding a collection of businesses. And it might require a different location. You might realize that the country or the region that allowed you to create wealth might not be the place that will allow you to keep it. And that's a realization that a lot of families in more exotic locations have, that they see that the wealth has to be somewhere else. And you might also realize, which I write about, how maybe it was one individual that was building it, but you have to include more people, the whole family, in an ideal scenario, where you need everybody's contribution, because they will be the one that will be the stewards of this capital. And you might need also advisors and help, and that have that kind of way of thinking about this wealth, that it's something that could last multiple generations. And sometimes the first generation that creates wealth is almost not in a position to grasp this. Or if they do, it's really late. Because they think that they could create it again. I think that's the catch. They think, I did it once, I could do it again. And I think it's a bit of a bittersweet, trap, where you feel like you could recreate it. And you might not, because the circumstances, the industry, the competitive environment that was there 40 years ago, it's not the environment you're operating right now, right? And you might not be able to recreate that kind of wealth the same way. But I see it as something that they have to come to that realization. And once they do, you see that something clicked. And they see that they're at a different stage of keeping the wealth and growing the wealth. I had Michael Sonnenfeld on the show, who works with a lot of wealthy individuals with Tiger 21. And he told me about that moment of revelation that he had himself, where he created the first wealth. And then he took some risks that were disproportionate. And he kind of had a second chance to learn that you have to adjust your risks, especially if you have more at stake. You know, Bill Gates, when he was dropping out of college, really so little at stake, right? He has a lifetime to correct the mistake. Microsoft never worked out. He goes to work somewhere else, and I'm sure he would have had a very comfortable job anyway. But once you have a substantial amount of money, there are certain risks that I say that even the richest people cannot afford. And I think that's what Michael was pointing out, how he meets individuals or families that got it. They realize, I am here, I have this substantial wealth, and where I'm going next will require a collection of businesses, my whole family, and maybe in some cases a different location or multiple locations for that wealth.
It reminds me of one of the sort of great inversions expressed by Charles de Gaulle: all that matters is to survive, the rest is just words. Or you hear business builders sometimes talk about, if I can just keep this business alive for the first 5 years or whatever, then good things can happen. But that comes across to me as sort of, if you optimize for survival, good things can happen.
That's the essence of the infinite game, right? What is it that I can do to be able to continue to play? I had Luca Delana on the show, who is a great friend, and he wrote a couple of books about ergodicity and risks. And he has this idea.
We've had Luca on.
You had Luca on.
Fantastic. Fellow European.
Luca is terrific. And he breaks down those...
ergodicity.
He has a gift for breaking down those very hard concepts in a way that it just clicks. It's relatable. Mm-hmm. And he says it's not the fastest skier that wins, but the one that is the fastest and participates in all the races. And we forget that, because we're optimizing for the speed. And in investing, where all is quantifiable seemingly, you want to optimize for the highest rate of return. And you realize, well, it comes with a risk. And one of those situations could be a complete wipeout. And if that's so, you're out of the game. You're completely out of the game. And a family that thinks in terms of 100 years, they don't want to have a single situation that would put them anywhere close to that kind of an experience, because making it back is almost impossible. I'm fascinated with the second and the third generation and the following generations, because they do know that they might not be, and it's a very humbling realization, in a position to recreate that wealth. They were not there. Maybe they joined later on. I know families where the kids joined once the business was well established in so many markets and so on. It's a very different experience, as you said, the first 5 years, where you're not so sure if it's going to work. You show up and you're not so sure. They don't have that experience, so they realize that they might not be in a position to make it back. It's the money they can't afford to lose. And it's a whole different way of looking at that wealth. And sometimes maybe it takes that generational shift that grandpa made it or grandma made it, and the kids or the grandkids are the stewards of it. Now, it can continue to grow and exceed anything that the previous generation ever created because of compounding, but it's a very different place to be. I want to highlight one more thing that I bring up. It's the money that I manage is the money that the clients don't need. And it's a fascinating concept to me, which is not talked about enough. And Jim O'Shaughnessy asked me, and I don't know if it was part of the episode or he asked me after we stopped recording. Sometimes the best questions get asked when I pause. and he said something along the lines, so what kind of money you want to manage? Or you enjoy managing? And I said, forgotten money. And he said, That's exactly right. And I explained what I meant by it. It's forgotten in the sense that the family can happily operate with whatever income they collect or whatever they have available year to year. But that money that we invest for that infinite open-ended time horizon is the money they could, for a long period of time, almost forget. They know it's there, but they don't have to call. They don't need it. It's not required day to day. That's the money you can really, really invest. And it's very, very different than I think a lot of capital is invested, which is the money that you do need. You need it for a down payment on the house, for the kitchen remodel, for a friend's restaurant that they're starting. They just need $500,000. They just need $1 million. They just need $2 million. That's not the money that can be invested, right? The money that can be truly, truly committed for the long run is the money that you could almost forget.
Yeah, very much. It strikes me as one of my friends, Chris Polk, sometimes says investors are often overweight what can be quantified and underweight everything else.
Yeah.
And when you're playing an infinite game and you're investing forgotten money, I think you're much more free to think about what maybe isn't as quantifiable and so on. So can you riff on that a little bit? I mean, I'm sure you're all over that idea. So what in what ways do you kind of take seriously the idea that maybe many families tend to be underweight, things that can't be quantified?
There's so much in there. I've been fascinated with the emotional side of investing. And I don't know if you noticed, but I had quite a few guests that bring in those intangible skills that I see how they're relevant in investing, although they might be coming from all kinds of fields. Because I feel like the technical side, you can at some point figure out, what are we trying to do? We're trying to own a collection of businesses that make sense and are worth holding over a long period of time. And we can narrow it down, and there will be different portfolios for even the three of us, and it's absolutely fine. But they're around a certain framework. And then there's the emotional side to it. And it doesn't matter most of the time until it does. And I think we brought it up more than once in this conversation, that how can I prepare myself for the moment? And Buffett puts it beautifully when he was talking about public speaking, how for him, it's not about his knees not shaking, but he wants to be able to speak when his knees are shaking. And I thought, I want to be able to invest when my knees are shaking, because there will be days when my knees will be shaking. There's no doubt about it, right? If you're completely honest about the experience, no matter how long you've been doing it, there will be a moment where your knees will be shaking. And you have to have an emotional makeup that will allow you to continue to make disciplined, deliberate, wise decisions in a moment where your knees are shaking under this table and you're making a decision. And I think that's really, really powerful. The other aspect I've been thinking about is more esoteric, but I think it's very interesting. How money is energy, and it has power. A single penny has power over us, and you can't even imagine what $1 million or 100 million or $1 billion can have, right? If you find a penny on the street, you immediately think, look, I'm a lucky guy, and you're smiling. You go to a meeting with a whole different demeanor just because you found a penny. It has power over us. It does. It's undeniable. And then if you receive an inheritance, $50 million or $200 million, it has power over you, and it has power over every single person in your life, over your spouse, over your kids, over your friends. It's a ripple. It's a tidal wave. It comes through. So having that acknowledgement of what kind of an impact that money has, and not operating in some sort of a scientific vacuum where, yes, we turned this amount to a larger amount, but thinking, what does it mean to the family? And I love moments where I feel like, all in all, it has a positive impact for you, your kids. It's hard for us to imagine, but there are moments, and I've been in rooms and conversations where the amount grew, the portfolio did very well, and the reaction I observed, and it's been a while, was, oh, it's a bigger problem. And it's fascinating to look at it this way. What do you mean it's a bigger problem? Well, because there's the emotional charge behind it, and maybe the money was given in a certain way that was not as smooth as they expected. And they think of it, oh, it's an even bigger elephant to deal with. And now we really have to tell kids about it. So it invites all those other questions and considerations, and it's a human experience that you have to be aware of. There's a beautiful book, Soul of Wealth, written by Lynn Twist, and she tells a story. She grew up in a family, her husband got wealthier throughout their lifetime. They were very comfortable at some point, and she ended up traveling around the world and helping people. But she was with Mother Teresa at some point, and Mother Teresa was helping in an orphanage. And this wealthy couple came in, and I'll tell the story the best I remember from the book. And that wealthy couple moved Mother Teresa around so that she fits in the photo. They wanted to have a photo of her. And Lynn says to Mother Teresa, "Why weren't you upset that they treated you this way?" And she said, you have compassion for the poor, but you have to have compassion for the rich. And it's something that doesn't come naturally, but we have to have compassion for people that experienced financial success.
It's a fascinating story. There's so much wisdom, I think, to squeeze out of that. Yeah. This connects to something I think I mentioned before we hit record I'd love to talk about, which is what conversations can't you have? Or what conversations are you working your way towards?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up. And I was thinking about the word easy. And I don't know if it's the best word to describe it, but I'd love my life to be easy. And I think a better way to describe it is a certain effortless flow. So I'd like to have clients that I'm looking forward to talking to them. Like the client I talked to this morning, I was looking forward to the conversation. We had some interesting things to talk about, and some of those topics are difficult. But I know I can help, and she truly appreciates what I'm trying to do and what we're both trying to accomplish. So I want clients that are easy in that sense. When I look at the portfolio, I want to have easy investments in the sense that they'll be up and down, but they won't surprise me and shock me, or they don't keep me up at night, right? So I want something that's easy in that sense. I'm not saying it's simple. I think it's hard work to find these things, but that's what I'm looking for. And when I'm thinking about running a business, and I've been running my own practice for almost a year now, I want it to just flow. So it doesn't take up, only the right things take up my attention. I know that John is obsessed with time, but I think about how I spend my time. So I want the business to just flow so that I can focus on clients and investments. Now, the opposite of that, I did take a call only a few weeks ago. And it wasn't a long call, and it was, most of my business comes through referrals. Somebody that knows me and respects me and wants me to talk to somebody. And I'm very open to it. I'm open to talking to people. Now, I take my time to onboard anybody, but once I see that it's a good fit, I'm very open about it. And I say, I think we should work together. And I'm very, very frank about it. But that call was a different call. And it was a call with somebody that came referred, and I think something got lost in translation, which may happen. It is what it is. Maybe I wasn't as specific about my expectations here, or maybe they misunderstood. But after that call, I felt absolutely drained, and I thought, this is the wrong person for me, and I'm the wrong person for them. And maybe I'm too honest here, but I would pay not to talk to them ever again. And it's not what they said, it's the way they spoke to me. And, speaking of respect for other people and how they treat each other, you can tell a lot by how somebody treats a waiter at a restaurant, or their assistant, how they treat people in their life. And I just got the very, very wrong impression of this individual. And that's the conversation I don't want to have. And now I have this luxury of saying, I'm not interested in having another conversation. Like, this is it. And I can afford it. Maybe it's a privilege that I can say, I choose not to, right? I don't have anybody who tells me that you have to have this quarterly quota and you have to open that many accounts. I can go on for a long time not opening a single new account. I'm fine. And it's a place that I want it to be, where if I do want to work with you, you'll know that. But if for some reason this is not the right fit, I don't want to have that conversation. And that's how I felt about it. And I noticed that it happens all around, and I think we just compromise and we say yes to a lot of opportunities that we wish we never said yes to. But at some point of your career, you want to be in a place where you could openly say, no, thank you.
Yeah, I think there's so much wisdom on someone. I want to say it was Paul Busser, the guys at Cedar Grove, but one of them said to me, when we were starting our business, we sat down and we thought, who do we want to do life with?
Mm-hmm.
And that was sort of their North Star for, building their investor base. And I thought, what a great way to frame it. I'm certain whenever we're on our deathbeds, we're not going to be sitting there thinking about the folks that were the wrong fit and that we maybe should have had the wisdom or the ability to say, this isn't aligned. Let's not pursue it. And so I love that framing. That's fantastic. And I love that you're at a position and a place where you've sort of set things up so you can, I think of you often as an extremely aligned person, and I can see you continuing to work towards that more and more and more and more and more ways. That's wonderful. It's a good opportunity to ask. We always ask our guests on the show, what help are you looking for? And that could really be anything, but what help are you looking for? And if somebody can be helpful, where can they find you?
Well, they can find me through all kinds of websites, both the podcast Talking Billions and Blue Infinitas Capital, the firm. And so there are many ways, and my email is out there. People can find me. In terms of help, I see my life as this open-ended, pursuit of curiosity. And I started writing and publishing because I wanted to open that door for people to find me and interact with me. And you and I talked about learning in public as a fascinating concept. But you don't always know who will find you and how they can make a contribution to your life and how you can make a contribution to their life. So I'd rather be not too specific about it, but I feel like if somebody's listening to this and they feel like they want to talk to me for whatever reason, I welcome any email, and I read all the emails, and even if it's a short answer, I'll answer all the emails. So I've heard wonderful stories of people from around the world that have lived all kinds of lives that you can't even imagine. And it's fascinating how those stories rhyme. And we talked about compassion, but just seeing this as a human experience, money and investing and wealth, it's just one aspect of our human experience. It's not all of it. It's some of it. It permeates all aspects of our life. But I think the more we talk about it, the more we're aware of it, I think the more we can live with it in a healthy, positive way, instead of being maybe afraid of it or pretend that it doesn't exist. It does exist. The money is there. How do we interact with it that's empowering and enriching?
Fantastic. And we'll definitely put your details and links in the show notes for those that want to reach out. We ask all our guests on the show the same closing question, which is, if you think of quality as capital Q, which is what we're studying here, capital Q quality, what is your most memorable experience with quality?
This could be a whole separate episode, you know that, right?
We'll tee up round 2 here. Yeah.
So Robert Pirsig, that I'm sure you know, wrote about quality quite a bit, and I had Chris back on the show, and I got to spend some time with Chris, who teaches the original security analysis course at Columbia. And we talked about quality, and I find it fascinating because the more, and I agree, the more you try to narrow down the definition, the more you're leaving outside of it, right? And you can dice it in so many ways as a static or dynamic experience. But I think what we're looking for in life and in investing is this aspirational, elevated experience, and you can label it as quality, both in people that we want to have in our life, the investments that we want to have in the portfolio, the way we want to run our life and our business. And then we see moments where you feel like I am in the presence of quality, right? I feel like what you guys are doing here and how much you've thought about this conversation. And I told you already, the questions and the topics, I'm in the presence of quality. And I know that, right? So those moments, if more of those I can have in my life, I think it's a happy place for me to be in. So I can give you very mundane examples of items in my life that have been with me for a long period of time. I have a pair of sunglasses that outlasted all sunglasses that I ever had. And all the other ones broke and faded, and this one pair, I actually lost it sailing one time, getting off the dinghy, and I dove to pick it up.
I love that.
And that pair of sunglasses, I wore it yesterday, and it's still with me. I don't know. It's just, it works. I never had to fix it. It just works, right? And I think I do want more of those experiences in life that it just works. And I said the word easy earlier, effortless, flow, maybe it's quality. But if you're in the presence of it, you just want it, and you want more of it. And it's the same with people. Sometimes when I think about the investment process, you find a business that just makes sense, it works, and it gets better and better. And then you ask me, well, show me in the income statement, show me all those things. But sometimes it's not that. Sometimes it's the way they treat their customers. Sometimes it's the way they postpone a price increase because they want to build loyalty. Sometimes it's the additional service they provide that they don't get credit for, something we talked about. But all those things add up, and you realize I am in the presence of something special. And I think life is so much easier if that's the kind of experience you search, whether it's your clients, your friends, your businesses you invest in, or the way you go about running a business. And I think it takes time to realize that. And once you do, I think you can't look at the world in any other way. I can't shop for sunglasses any other way.
Absolutely. That's such a good story. Things that if you lost them, you'd go diving to get them back.
There you go.
That's a good list.
Well, Bogie, from our end, in studying what you have put out there into the world, you have one of the most amazing minds for distilling complex ideas into simple, relatable ways. And that quality just jumps off the page. So from our perspective, it's been one of the most enjoyable couple of weeks, really just diving deep into what you have shared out there. And so thank you from our end.
No, I really appreciate it. What the audience might not know, maybe John doesn't even know, Paul and I spent like 10 days on a sailboat at some point. And Paul and I had those conversations, not very different than this one in so many ways, in some beach bars or coffee places in some exotic locations. So
surrounded by turtles. It was fascinating.
If you do round 2 on that, I'd love to join. That sounds incredible. Maybe we'll record the follow up to this episode. We'll record from an exotic location.
I do have one parting question for you, Bogie, on this. One pursuit that I've always admired, you have a way of relating to nature, and through sailing, through surfing, through where you've lived in the world, where you've traveled in the world. You seem to spend a lot of time in nature, and you seem to study natural patterns and bring it back to the investment world and to what you do and how you live. I wonder, where did you learn that? Like, who modeled that to you? And what qualities have you, like, just one or two things that you've really taken that have taken time to embody? Like, I'd be interested to just unpack that if we could, just to humor me for a couple of minutes.
No, I think it's a brilliant question, and so many images popped in my head as I was thinking about what you're asking about. I think I have to go back to the early days. And there were so many moments where either my parents or grandparents exposed me to nature. And in this case, it was Poland, the woods, the lakes. And one of the things I want to bring up, my maternal grandfather was obsessed with mushroom picking. It's kind of a tradition in Poland, less so maybe these days. They would go to the woods in the fall and pick mushrooms, wild mushrooms, and you would know which ones to pick. So since I could walk, he would take me to the woods, and he grew up in Poland when the woods were, dense and wild, and he told me stories from 50 years earlier that you would go to the woods and you had to be on your knees to pick mushrooms because there were so many. By the time I was picking mushrooms, there were fewer. But anyways, maybe that's a reference to investing too. There are times when there are a lot of things to pick, and there are moments when there's nothing to pick. But that's a whole different story. But I was taught to be appreciative of what nature is, and hearing that peace and silence that nature can provide. And these days, there are books and people talking about being in the woods, being in nature, how we need it as humans, and we forgot it. And I love the ocean, being out at sea and scuba diving, and there's something very peaceful about it. And in nature, there's no waste. And there's always a reason why something is happening. Even a hurricane that comes through, and we were somewhere after the hurricane, and it's to see the devastation of what the hurricane does. Just to talk about it for a second, I mean, at that time when I saw what happened after the hurricane, I thought, is there anything positive about it? Like the optimist in me was thinking, what you see after the damage, you feel like there's nothing good about it. But then I started doing some research, and I realized that the hurricanes are actually part of nature, and they allow the lower plants to grow. They move seeds from a place to a place. They refresh the ecosystem, and there's a whole list of benefits of what happens after the hurricane, and the nature just reclaims the space and booms all over again. And the same happens with fires, but we see this as not something we want because of how we, urbanize and develop the world. But anything in nature happens for a reason, and crises as such, even in the investment world, it has to happen. It's a cleansing force. Some businesses don't belong, some practices are not sustainable. And the longer we postpone it, the bigger issue we have to deal with. So looking at nature as kind of a guidance of what else is happening around us, it's an ebb and a flow, and it has a cyclical nature to it. But it's natural, right? So trying to control it or deny it, it's not helpful. You have to learn to live with it.
Yeah. Thank you, sir.
In nature, there is no waste. I think I'm going to be thinking about that for a while. I read somewhere recently, I don't know how well known this is, it might be, but it was new to me, that the great forests in the Pacific Northwest in the States rely on salmon migration and death to bring nutrients to the trees, the huge trees that grow there. And it's one of those, I read that and I thought about it, and I thought, man, for everything like that, we realize what are the things we haven't yet realized, the good from the hurricane, so to speak, or whatever it is. So that's incredible. It's a great story.
I'll leave you with one story that really spoke to me about hermit crabs. I don't know if you guys are familiar with hermit crabs. They take on little shells that somebody else left behind, speaking of no waste, and they live in them. They can't make a home of their own. And then they have apparently little parties, so to speak, where they get together in a circle, and since they grow, they trade up the shell so that they move to the next shell, and they rearrange themselves in a circle. Maybe somebody listening to it can share more about it, but they don't drop and lose the shell. They give it to the friend next door. But then it made me think that one of them is without a shell at the end of the process when you think about it. But that's a separate story. But I thought it's such a cute idea that there is no waste when you really think about it. Waste as such, it's a human, civilized or first world problem that we have too much of something. In nature, everything happens for a reason. And you talked about salmon, which I read about, how it feels like such a waste. No, it gets used and repurposed. Mm-hmm. I think it's fascinating to look at it this way. And we talked about miracles, and isn't it a miracle? I mean, the fact that we are here talking, living on this blue planet, tiny little speck in space, and everything we are made of today has been on this planet for millions of years, right? Or all the particles that were made of. Part of it might have been a dinosaur before or something else. But here we are, talking about the world in such a fascinating, abstract way. I find it very alluring.
Absolutely. There's so many. I think we're going to have to do this again. My brain is now just full of more directions to take this. But let me say, add my thanks to Paul's. This was fun. Certainly lots of food for thought. I would love to do this again. But for today, Definitely. Thank you so much for joining us.
What a pleasure. Thank you both.
Thank you, Bogey. Enjoy your surfing.
Thank you, Paul. Having been on the other side of it on so many occasions, I know how much thought and effort goes into preparing for a conversation, and I couldn't thank you both enough. And your two teammates that are traveling for giving it so much thought. And I really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Bogey.
Pleasure is ours, yeah. Thank you for listening. For more resources, please visit our website, theartofquality.co. If you know someone who would be a good fit for this format, please reach out.